Imagine, for a moment, the sound of a heavy, rhythmic heartbeat, the low, persistent thrum of the North Sea as it pushes against the jagged edges of a coastal cliff. There is a specific kind of grey that exists only here in these northern waters, a colour that is neither sky nor sea, but a misty, salt-heavy veil that blurs the line where the world ends and the water begins. The waves move with a slow, cold deliberation, rolling over one another in endless successions of foam and deep, dark emerald. To look out from the shores of eastern England or the lowlands of the Netherlands is to see a vast, empty expanse, a liquid desert that seems to have existed since the dawn of time, indifferent to the lives of men and the passage of centuries. We have long viewed this sea as a barrier, a moat of freezing brine that separates the British Isles from the heart of Europe. But the water is a master of disguise, and its current state is merely a brief chapter in a much longer, much more silent story. Beneath those churning waves, under the weight of 1,000 storms and the paths of 1,000,000 ships, lies a landscape that was once defined by the rustle of leaves and the tracks of migrating deer. If we could reach down and peel away the surface of the ocean like a heavy blanket, we would not find a flat, featureless plain of silt. Instead, we would see the ghosts of rolling hills, the winding scars of ancient riverbeds, and the deep, sheltered shadows of valleys that haven't felt the warmth of the sun in over 8,000 years. This is the world of Doggerland, a vast, drowned continent that once served as the true heart of Europe. It was a place of immense beauty and staggering abundance, a bridge of earth and forest that allowed our ancestors to walk from what is now London to what is now Amsterdam without ever getting their feet wet. It was a land of giants, where woolly mammoths wandered through marshes and hunters tracked elk through thickets of birch and oak. As you settle into your blankets and let the weight of the day begin to drift away, you might find comfort in the thought that history is often much deeper and more mysterious than the maps suggest. Here at the Slumber Archives, we explore these forgotten corners of our past every single day, weaving stories of lost worlds to help you find your way into a restful sleep. If you enjoy these nightly journeys through time, please consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss a new narration. A gentle like on the video also helps others find their way to this quiet space. Now, let us return to that silent, submerged world and the realization that the North Sea was not always a sea at all. To understand Doggerland, we must look at the concept of deep time, a scale of history so vast that the rise and fall of empires seem like the mere blinking of an eye. During the height of the last great ice age, so much of the Earth's water was locked away in massive, miles-thick glaciers that the sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than they are today. The North Sea floor was high and dry, a sprawling tundra that eventually softened into a lush, temperate paradise as the climate began to warm. Archaeologists use the term stratigraphy to describe the layers of time built up in the Earth, a sort of vertical history book where the oldest stories are buried at the bottom. In the case of Doggerland, the book has been submerged, its pages soaked in salt water, yet the evidence remains. Fishermen for centuries have hauled up more than just cod and haddock in their nets. They have pulled up the blackened, fossilized teeth of mammoths, the elegant, carved points of antler harpoons, and even the prehistoric remains of human beings who once called these drowned valleys home. These artifacts are whispers from a time known as the Mesolithic, a period of transition after the ice retreated, but before the invention of farming. It was a time of the hunter-gatherer, a time when humans lived in perfect, precarious harmony with the shifting seasons. We often think of prehistoric people as primitive, but the craftsmanship found in the silt of the North Sea suggests a culture of profound skill and deep connection to the land. They navigated a world that was constantly changing, watching as the marshes expanded and the forests grew thick with hazel and pine. The transition from a frozen wasteland to a fertile heartland happened during a period scientists call the Younger Dryas, a final, cold snap that gripped the Earth before the modern era of warmth truly began. When the ice finally melted for good, the water had to go somewhere. It trickled down from the mountains, filled the lakes, and began its slow, inevitable march across the low-lying plains. For generations, the people of Doggerland would have noticed the change. Perhaps a favourite hunting ground becoming a bit soggier each spring, or a coastal path that was once dry now requiring a dug-out canoe to cross. It was a slow-motion catastrophe, a gradual loss of territory that took place over thousands of years. There was no single day when the ocean rushed in and swallowed the world whole. Rather, it was a persistent, patient rising of the tide that never went back out. Imagine walking through a forest where the ground is carpeted in thick moss and the air is filled with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. You can hear the distant call of a crane in the wetlands and the soft footfalls of a red deer nearby. This was the reality for the inhabitants of Doggerland. They built their homes on the high ground, which we now know as the Dogger Bank, a shallow sandbank in the middle of the North Sea that today poses a hazard to modern shipping. Back then, it was a vast plateau overlooking a network of lagoons and estuaries, a place so rich in fish and fowl that it may have been one of the most densely populated parts of the prehistoric world. It was a golden age of sorts, a time of plenty before the geography of Europe was severed forever. As we journey back through the millennia, we must confront the limits of what we can truly know. Much of Doggerland remains a mystery, hidden beneath meters of sand and the restless currents of the deep. We rely on seismic surveys, a process of sending sound waves down through the water to map the contours of the buried landscape, to catch glimpses of this lost world. We see the outlines of massive river systems, like the Great Thames and the Rhine, which once joined together in a singular, mighty flow that carved its way across the plain toward the Atlantic. We see the imprints of ancient lakes that were once teeming with life, now silent and filled with salt. The evidence speaks of a world that was vibrant and whole, a landscape that was not a bridge between places, but a place in its own right. There is a certain melancholy in the thought of all those miles of forest and meadow resting in the dark, cold depths. It reminds us that the earth is not a static thing, that the boundaries we draw on maps are temporary, and the land we walk upon is subject to the whims of the climate and the slow, grinding cycles of the planet. Doggerland was lost not through a sudden act of anger from the gods, but through the quiet, relentless physics of a warming world. The trees died as their roots were poisoned by salt. The animals retreated to higher ground, and eventually, the last of the hunters looked out over a horizon that had become entirely water. The silence that now hangs over the North Sea floor is a heavy one, weighted with the memories of 1,000,000 sunrises that no human eye will ever see again. As the waves continue their rhythmic pulse above, we are left to wonder about the stories that remain trapped in the silt, the songs that were sung around fires that have long since been extinguished by the sea, and the enduring mystery of a land that once was and is no more. Imagine a world where the very rhythm of the planet has slowed to a frozen heartbeat, a time when the great engines of the climate have ground to a halt under the weight of 1,000 winters. To understand the world that lies beneath the North Sea, we must first travel back 20,000 years to the height of the last glacial maximum. At this moment in deep time, the Earth is a different landscape entirely, one defined not by the blue of the oceans, but by the blinding, crystalline white of the ice, gigantic sheets of frozen water, some 2 miles thick, sit heavily upon the northern reaches of the globe, pressing down upon the continents with a force so immense that the very crust of the earth bows beneath them. Because so much of the world's water is trapped within these towering walls of ice, the oceans themselves have retreated, drawn back like a long, slow breath being held by the planet. The sea levels have dropped by more than 120 meters, roughly 400 feet below where they sit today. As the water recedes, vast territories that had been hidden for eons begin to emerge into the cold, thin air. Land that had been the domain of the tide becomes the domain of the wind. And so, the map of Europe begins to stretch and transform. The familiar jagged edges of the coastline dissolve, replaced by a massive contiguous landmass that knows no watery borders. In this distant era, there is no English Channel, no cold barrier of the North Sea to separate the white cliffs of Dover from the rolling plains of France. Instead, a traveller could have walked from the heart of what is now London all the way to the coast of Denmark without ever getting their feet wet in salt water. Great Britain is not an island, but a high, rocky peninsula, a western extension of the European continent, connected by a vast and mysterious plain that archaeologists call Doggerland. As the years passed, this emerging bridge of land became a silent witness to the changing moods of the earth, a wide expanse of territory that was neither sea nor yet fully forest, but something raw and full of ancient potential. Initially, this newly birthed land is a harsh and unforgiving place. It is a world of tundra, a landscape of low-lying mosses, hardy sedges, and dwarf shrubs that hug the ground to escape the biting northern gales. The air is crisp and dry, carrying the scent of crushed stone and frozen earth. In the summer months, the sun lingers long over the horizon, casting golden light across endless fields of swaying grasses. But the warmth is fleeting. The ground remains locked in permafrost just beneath the surface, a layer of frozen soil that prevents large trees from taking root. It is a vista of immense scale and profound stillness, where the only sounds are the whistling of the wind and the distant, rhythmic cracking of the ice sheets far to the north. As we look across this ancient tundra, we must consider the limits of what we know about such a place. The evidence for this landscape is gathered from the deep, from core samples pulled through hundreds of feet of water and silt, revealing layers of pollen and ancient soil that have been preserved in the anaerobic darkness. This science of stratigraphy, the study of the layers of the earth, tells us that this was a land of transition. It was a bridge not just for humans, but for the great megafauna of the Pleistocene. Mammoth and woolly rhinoceros roamed these plains, their heavy footfalls echoing across the frozen ground as they migrated in search of the hardy vegetation that flourished in the brief, bright summers. Meanwhile, the humans who lived on the fringes of this world looked toward the horizon with eyes full of curiosity and need. To them, this land was not a bridge to be crossed, but a home to be explored. Despite the cold, the tundra was a place of abundance for those who knew its secrets. The rivers that carved through the plain were thick with fish, and the vast herds of reindeer provided everything a community needed to survive, from meat and fat to hides for warmth and bone for tools. The connection between Britain and the continent was a highway for life, a corridor of movement that allowed the first pioneers to push further into the unknown reaches of the north. We might wonder what it felt like to stand in the center of that great plain, miles from any recognizable landmark, surrounded only by the gentle curvature of the earth and the immense vaulted sky. There is a specific kind of silence that exists in such open spaces, a silence that feels heavy with the weight of time itself. The people of this era lived in a state of constant dialogue with the elements, their lives woven into the seasonal migrations and the shifting patterns of the ice. They were not merely survivors, they were masters of a landscape that no longer exists, a world where the horizon was an invitation rather than a boundary. As the centuries turned into millennia, the climate began a slow and fitful dance of change. The intense cold of the glacial maximum started to lose its grip, and the great ice sheets began to groan and weep. This process was not a steady thaw, but a series of pulses, moments of warming followed by sudden, sharp returns to the cold. One such event, known to scientists as the Younger Dryas, saw the glaciers surge back one last time, a final gasp of the ice age that briefly turned the clock back on the warming world. But even this could not stop the inevitable. The ice was destined to retreat, and as it did, the very shape of Doggerland began to shift once more. The tundra, once so stark and open, began to soften. The permafrost melted, allowing the roots of birch and pine to reach deeper into the soil. The vast, dry plains were slowly crisscrossed by a network of braided rivers and shallow lakes, fed by the meltwater of the dying glaciers. The environment was becoming more complex, more lush, and more inviting. But this new life came with a hidden cost. Every drop of water that trickled from the ice and flowed into the rivers eventually found its way to the sea, and the sea, patient and relentless, was beginning to rise. It is difficult for us to grasp the scale of these changes when they occur over thousands of years. To a human living in the heart of Doggerland, the world likely felt eternal. The hills were where they had always been, and the rivers followed paths carved by their ancestors. And yet, the ground beneath their feet was part of a slow-motion drama, a geological transformation that would eventually erase their entire world from the map. The physical connection between the islands and the mainland was a fragile one, held in place only by the precarious balance of the global temperature. As we contemplate this lost tundra, we are reminded of the limits of human memory. We have no written records of this time, no maps drawn on parchment, no names for the mountains or the valleys that now lie beneath the waves. We have only the fragments, the flint tools found in the nets of fishermen, the bones of animals that shouldn't be in the middle of the sea, and the silent testimony of the seabed itself. It is a landscape of shadows, a place where the boundary between history and myth becomes blurred. The transition from a frozen wasteland to a fertile plain was a slow awakening, a period of deep time where the earth seemed to be reinventing itself. The harshness of the initial tundra gave way to a land of plenty, but it was a beauty born of a temporary state. The very forces that made the land habitable were the same forces that would eventually reclaim it. As the ice continued to melt, the great plain of the North Sea stood at the threshold of its golden age, unaware that the water was already beginning its long, slow march toward the shore. The air no longer carries the sharp metallic sting of perpetual frost. Instead, it begins to carry the scent of damp earth and the sweet, heavy fragrance of awakening life. If we could stand upon a high ridge in what is now the middle of the North Sea 10,000 years ago, we would hear a sound that had been absent for millennia, the sound of constant, rhythmic dripping. It is the heartbeat of a world in transition. From the massive, 2-mile-thick walls of ice far to the north, millions of gallons of ancient water are being liberated, trickling through the cracks of the glaciers and gathering into the first true veins of this new landscape. As the great weight of the ice sheets begins to pull back, the land itself seems to exhale. Geologists call this process
isostatic rebound, a slow tectonic sigh where the Earth's crust, once pushed deep into the mantle by the crushing weight of the glaciers, begins to rise back up. But while the land rises, the world is also warming. We enter the Mesolithic, or the Middle Stone Age, a time of profound ecological shifting. The younger Dryas, that final bitter cold snap that tried to pull the world back into the freezer, has finally broken. The climate is no longer a predator, it has become a provider. The transformation begins with the pioneers. On the fringes of the retreating ice, where the soil is little more than crushed rock and glacial silt, the first brave inhabitants take root. These are the lichens and the hardy mosses, silent workers that spend centuries breaking down stone into the very first layers of fertile earth. They are followed by the dwarf birch and the Arctic willow, low-lying shrubs that hug the ground to escape the lingering winds. But as the decades turn into centuries, the wind carries new travellers. The winged seeds of the silver birch and the hardy Scots pine drift across the plains, finding purchase in the stabilizing soil. Imagine the visual shift of this lost world. The stark, blinding whites and greys of the Paleolithic are being swallowed by a rising tide of green. It is a slow-motion explosion of colour. The vast, flat expanse of Doggerland, that bridge of earth connecting Britain to the European mainland, is becoming a lush, emerald paradise. The birch forests arrive first, their white bark gleaming like ghosts among the morning mists, creating a thin, shimmering canopy that allows plenty of light to reach the forest floor. Beneath them, a carpet of ferns and wildflowers begins to spread, turning the once barren tundra into a garden of unimaginable scale. The stabilization of the soil is a quiet miracle of deep time. As the root systems of these new forests intertwine, they knit the loose glacial debris into a solid foundation. They hold the earth together against the seasonal floods, creating a complex network of drainage and filtration. The meltwater, once a chaotic and destructive force, is now channeled into great, meandering river systems. These are the ancestors of the Rhine, the Thames, and the Elbe, but in this age they do not flow into the sea as we know it. Instead, they converge in the heart of the North Sea plain, feeding massive freshwater lakes and sprawling marshlands that teem with life. The soundscape of the north has changed entirely. The silence of the ice has been replaced by the rustle of leaves and the constant bubbling chatter of new rivers. These waterways are the lifelines of the Mesolithic spring. They carry the nutrients of the thawing earth down into the valleys, creating rich alluvial plains where the grass grows tall enough to hide a man. To the animals and the humans moving into this space, it must have felt as though the world was being born for the very first time. The air is thick with the hum of insects, the dragonflies and bees that have followed the flowers northward, and the sky is frequently darkened by the migration of millions of birds, returning to nesting grounds that had been buried under ice for 100,000 years. As the pine forests begin to move in, replacing the birch, the character of the land deepens. The pines bring a different kind of shadow, a cooler, more permanent shade. Their needles carpet the ground, creating a soft, muffled world where the footsteps of a hunter would be virtually silent.
The scent of resin and sap fills the air, a thick and heady perfume that defines this golden age of the northern wilderness. This is not the dark, impenetrable forest of later fairy tales, but a vibrant, sun-drenched woodland interspersed with wide, grassy clearings and sparkling lagoons. Everywhere there is the presence of water. It is the great architect of this landscape. The melting ice sheets to the north are not just disappearing, they are being redistributed. The vast plains of Doggerland are becoming a labyrinth of wetlands. In the low-lying areas, the water settles into fens and bogs, places where the peat begins to accumulate layer by layer, trapping the history of the forest within its acidic depths. These bogs act as a memory bank for the earth, preserving the pollen, the leaves, and even the timber of the trees that are now beginning their long reign. The rivers themselves are broad and shallow, silver ribbons that catch the light of the long summer evenings. They are filled with salmon and trout, pushing upstream against the gentle currents of the meltwater. For the human groups moving into these territories, the rivers are more than just a source of food. They are highways. In a world of growing forests, the water offers the easiest path through the landscape. We can imagine small groups of people, perhaps no more than a few families, navigating these channels in dugout canoes carved from the very trees that now surround them. They are moving into a land of plenty, a place where the struggle for survival has shifted from enduring the cold to mastering the abundance of the forest. But even in this moment of lush prosperity, the mystery of deep time whispers a warning. The very warmth that brought the forests and the rivers is also the warmth that is raising the level of the distant oceans. For now, the sea is far away, hidden behind the horizon, but every drop of meltwater that feeds a northern river is also a drop that contributes to the rising tide. The humans of the Mesolithic spring could not have known that the ground beneath their feet was a gift from the ice, a gift that would be rescinded as soon as the ice was gone. The stabilization of the soil and the arrival of the great forests created a sense of permanence that was, in the grand scale of the Earth's history, entirely illusory. To a person living 70 generations ago, the forest was eternal. The oak and the elm were beginning to join the pine and the birch, creating a diverse and resilient ecosystem. The soil was deep and rich, the climate was stable, and the seasons followed a predictable, benevolent cycle. It was a world of now, a world where the horizon seemed to stretch on forever in every direction, a vast and hospitable plain that seemed to have no end. As we look back through the layers of time, through the stratigraphy of the seabed, where these forests now lie submerged, we see the evidence of this brief, shining era. We find the remains of those pioneer plants, the microscopic grains of pollen that tell the story of the greening of the north. We see the transition from the cold-loving species to the temperate ones, a botanical record of a world warming up and stretching its limbs. It is a reminder that the earth is never truly static. It is a restless, breathing entity, constantly reshaping its surface in response to the great cycles of the sun and the stars. The Mesolithic spring was a time of profound hope for the living things that inhabited it. The shadow of the ice had finally lifted, and in its wake it had left a fertile canvas. The rivers flowed clear and cold, the forests hummed with the vitality of 1,000 new species, and the land was a bridge between worlds. It was the golden age of the Great Plain, a period of equilibrium where the forces of the earth seemed to be in perfect balance. But time, like the water from the melting glaciers, never stops moving. And as the forests reached their peak, the distant sea was already beginning to find its way into the lowlands, marking the start of a slow and inevitable transformation.
Imagine a drop of rain falling over the dark, pine-scented mountains of Central Europe 10,000 years ago. It begins a journey that, in our modern world, would end abruptly at the salt-crusted edges of the Dutch coast or the choppy grey waters of the English Channel. But in this lost epoch, that single drop of water is merely at the beginning of a much longer, more winding odyssey across a vast and silent plain. The geography of this vanished world was defined not by coastlines, but by the majestic, slow-moving veins of the earth. As the great ice sheets retreated further north, they left behind a landscape that was almost impossibly flat, a gentle tilt of the continent that invited the great rivers of Europe to stretch out and mingle in ways that seem like a dream to modern cartographers. Here the Rhine was not the solitary giant we know today. Instead, it moved with a patient, meandering grace, its silver ribbons of water weaving through the silt and the tall grasses of the Doggerland interior. As the Rhine flowed north and west, it encountered the Meuse, and further along it reached out to embrace the Thames. Today, we think of the Thames as a quintessential British river, a winding path through London toward the North Sea. But in the age of the Great Plain, the Thames was a tributary, a smaller branch of a much grander system. These three great rivers, the Rhine, the Meuse, and the Thames, merged into a singular, colossal waterway that geologists and archaeologists often call the Channel River. This was a river of unimaginable scale, a wide, slow-moving artery of fresh water that carved a path through what is now the seabed between England and France. It did not rush toward the sea with the frantic energy of a mountain stream. Rather, it drifted, looping in great, lazy oxbows across the fertile lowlands. The water was clear and cool, filtered by endless miles of reed beds and marshy fens. It carried with it the nutrient-rich runoff of half a continent, creating a corridor of life that was the beating heart of the North Sea plain. To stand on the banks of the Channel River would be to witness a world of profound stillness and abundance. The air would be thick with the hum of dragonflies and the distant, rhythmic splashing of massive sturgeons breaching the surface. Because the land was so level, the river did not stay within fixed, stony banks. Instead, it breathed with the seasons. During the spring thaw, it would spill over into vast, shallow lagoons and freshwater basins, turning the center of the plain into a shimmering mosaic of islands and waterways. These freshwater basins were the true sanctuaries of the era. They acted as massive natural reservoirs, moderating the climate of the lowlands and providing a reliable source of life even during the driest summers. For the nomadic groups of humans wandering these plains, the confluence of the rivers was a place of supreme importance. In the language of archaeology, we look for stratigraphy, the layering of time in the earth, to tell us where people stayed. And though much of this evidence now lies beneath 30 meters of salt water and sand, the scattered artifacts recovered by fishing trawlers tell a story of a people who lived in perfect rhythm with these waters. They followed the rivers as if they were highways. The slow pace of the water meant that travel by dugout canoe was easy and efficient, allowing families to move between the rich hunting grounds of the interior and the burgeoning wetlands of the west. To these early inhabitants, the river was not a barrier to be crossed, but a provider to be followed. It offered more than just water. It was a source of flint pebbles washed down from the chalk hills, of sturdy reeds for weaving, and of an endless supply of fish and waterfowl. As the years passed, the Channel River continued its long crawl toward the southwest, eventually emptying into the Atlantic Ocean, far beyond the modern-day tip of Cornwall. At its mouth, it would have been a delta of staggering proportions, a labyrinth of salt marshes and tidal flats where the fresh water of the continent finally met the cold, rising pulse of the sea. But for most of its length, it remained a world of sweetness, a realm of soft mud and deep green shadows where the memory of the ice was fading into the mist. The ecosystem supported by this river system was perhaps one of the most productive in human history. The silty soil, deposited over millennia by the seasonal flooding, was incredibly fertile, supporting dense thickets of willow and alder. These riparian forests acted as a buffer, a lush transition zone between the deep woods of the higher ground and the open water of the river channels. Here, the biodiversity was staggering. We find traces in the submerged peat of giant elks, wild cattle known as aurochs, and even the lingering presence of the woolly mammoth, all drawn to the life-giving flow of the great river merger. The sheer flatness of the landscape meant that the water moved with a heavy, deliberate dignity. There were no rapids here, no waterfalls to break the silence, only the sound of the wind through the sedge and the soft lap of water against the muddy shore. It is a strange thought to consider that where massive container ships now navigate the deep shipping lanes of the English Channel, there was once a valley floor, a place where a person could sit by a campfire and watch the moon reflect perfectly in the still glassy surface of the merged Rhine and Thames. As we look at the bathymetry, the underwater topography of the North Sea today, we can still trace the ghost of this river system. Using seismic reflection, which is a way of mapping the layers beneath the seafloor using sound waves, scientists have revealed the ancient, buried valleys of these rivers. They are still there, carved into the bedrock, filled with the sands of time and the weight of the ocean. These maps show us a world that was interconnected in a way that is difficult to grasp today. Britain was not an island. It was a highland, a series of hills overlooking the magnificent valley of the Channel River. And yet, this very system of life was also a harbinger of the change to come. The rivers were the pathways that the rising sea would eventually use to reclaim the land. As the global temperature continued to climb during the Holocene, the current geological epoch that began about 11,700 years ago, the meltwater from the remaining ice caps began to push the ocean levels higher. The sea didn't just climb the cliffs, it crept up the river valleys. It pushed back against the flow of the Rhine and the Thames, turning fresh water brackish and then salty. But that final inundation was still far in the distance. For many centuries, the great river systems remained the dominant feature of the landscape, a sprawling, watery paradise that seemed as eternal as the stars. The humans who lived there would have known every bend, every shallow crossing, and every hidden pool where the fish gathered in the heat of noon. They lived in a world of horizontal vastness, where the horizon was always distant and the water was a constant, murmuring companion. As we drift deeper into the history of this drowned forest, we must try to imagine the scale of this lost geography. It was a place of transition where the solid earth and the fluid water existed in a delicate shifting embrace. The meandering pace of the rivers reflected the pace of life itself, unhurried, grounded in the immediate needs of the season and deeply connected to the pulse of the planet. The great rivers were the architects of Doggerland, shaping the soil and the lives of everything that walked upon it, unaware that the very Atlantic they flowed toward was slowly, quietly, beginning to march inland to meet them. Beneath the canopy of this lost world, the air is heavy with the scent of damp earth and the sweet, resinous perfume of sap. We find ourselves standing in a landscape that feels both hauntingly familiar and deeply alien. A place where the shadows are long and the silence is layered with the sounds of a vibrant, breathing wilderness. As the climate of the early Holocene warmed, the tundra gave way to a green explosion, a slow-motion wave of life that transformed the vast plains into a sanctuary of towering giants. Imagine the ground beneath your feet, firm and rich with the accumulation of thousands of years of fallen leaves. You are walking through a dense, primeval forest of oak, hazel, and elm, trees that have grown to immense proportions, their roots drawing strength from the fertile silt left behind by the ancient rivers. The light filters through the high branches in emerald shafts, illuminating patches of moss and fern that carpet the floor in a soft, verdant velvet. There is a profound stillness here, yet it is a stillness teeming with hidden movement. The hazel trees are heavy with nuts, providing a bounty for the smaller creatures, while the great oaks stand like silent sentinels, their wide limbs offering shelter from the Atlantic rains that have begun to fall with greater frequency. As you move deeper into the woods, the trees begin to thin, revealing the true majesty of the Doggerland megafauna. These are the titans of the deep time, animals that seem like figments of a dream to our modern eyes. Emerging from the silver birch thickets, a woolly mammoth moves with a slow, rhythmic grace. Though the world is warming and their range is slowly shrinking toward the north, they still roam these plains, their massive tusks sweeping through the tall grasses. Their presence is felt in the vibration of the earth, a low grounding hum that resonates in your chest. Nearby, a pride of European lions lounges in a sun-drenched clearing, their tawny coats blending perfectly with the dried reeds. These were not the lions of the African savanna, but a distinct lineage adapted to the cooler, temperate forests of the north. Powerful predators who shared these woods with the early human hunters in a relationship defined by mutual respect and wary distance. Perhaps the most ethereal of all these inhabitants is the giant elk, also known as the Irish elk, though its kingdom stretched far across this drowned plain. To see one is to witness a marvel of biological ambition. Their antlers, spanning 12 feet from tip to tip, seem too heavy for any living creature to bear, yet they move through the dense undergrowth with a surprising, ghostly agility. They are the sovereigns of the glades, their silhouettes appearing and disappearing in the mist like spirits of the forest. The sheer scale of these animals reminds us of a time when the world was larger, when the boundaries between the human and the wild were not yet drawn with fences and stone walls. As the forest gives way to the sprawling wetlands, the sensory experience shifts. The air becomes cooler, carrying the sharp, clean scent of fresh water and the earthy musk of the marsh. Here, the biodiversity of Doggerland reaches a fever pitch. The wetlands are a mosaic of reeds, sedges, and shallow pools, shimmering under a pale northern sky. This is a kingdom of water and wing. The sky is often darkened by the passage of thousands of waterfowl, swans, geese, and ducks that migrate in vast, honking clouds, their formations stretching from horizon to horizon. The sound of their wings is like the rushing of a distant wind, a constant reminder of the seasonal pulse that governs all life. In the clear, slow-moving channels, the water is thick with fish. Salmon and sturgeon, some reaching lengths that would seem impossible today, navigate the labyrinthine waterways, their silver scales catching the light as they leap above the surface. For the humans who lived here, these wetlands were a garden of plenty. The edges of the marshes were rich with edible tubers and reeds that could be woven into baskets or mats, while the abundance of fish and fowl provided a security that allowed communities to linger, to build, and to observe the world around them with a patient eye. Walking through this wilderness, one is struck by the sheer density of life. Every niche is occupied, every shadow holds a story. There is the low grunt of a wild boar rooting through the leaf litter, the sharp bark of a fox, and the distant, mournful howl of a wolf pack echoing through the valley. It is a world of constant, quiet drama, a cycle of birth and decay that has played out for millennia without interruption. The soil you walk upon is a living archive, composed of the remains of countless generations of flora and fauna, all contributing to the richness of the Doggerland earth. And yet, there is an underlying tension in this paradise, a subtle change in the rhythm of the tides and the height of the groundwater. The very trees that provide shelter are beginning to feel the salt in their roots as the sea edges closer, year by year. The elm and the oak, so seemingly permanent, are part of a landscape that is fundamentally transient. We look at these forests now through the lens of archaeology and marine geology, recovering blackened stumps of oak from the bottom of the North Sea, wood that has been preserved in the anaerobic mud for 8,000 years. When these fragments are brought to the surface, they still smell of the ancient forest, a faint lingering scent of damp wood and deep time that bridges the gap between our world and theirs. The biodiversity of Doggerland was not merely a backdrop for human history, it was the very fabric of existence. The humans who walked these paths were not separate from the woolly mammoth or the giant elk. They were participants in the same grand ecological narrative. They understood the language of the birds and the timing of the salmon run.
They knew which fungi grew at the base of the birch trees and which herbs could soothe a fever. Their lives were woven into the forest floor, and the riverbanks grounded in a deep sensory connection to the land that we can only begin to imagine. As we stand in this reimagined wilderness, we are reminded of the fragility of even the most robust ecosystems. The dense forests of hazel and oak, the teeming marshes, and the magnificent megafauna were all part of a world that believed itself to be eternal. The sheer scale of the life here suggests a permanence that makes its eventual disappearance all the more haunting. It was a place of abundance and beauty, a primeval European Eden that flourished in the quiet centuries before the maps were redrawn by the rising tide. The sensory experience of Doggerland was one of immersion, of being completely surrounded by the sights, sounds, and smells of a world in balance. The rustle of the wind through the oak leaves, the soft squelch of the marshland underfoot, and the sight of a mammoth moving through the morning mist are all part of a lost heritage. We are left to wonder how many other such worlds lie hidden beneath the waves, their forests turned to coal and their stories whispered only in the shifting sands of the seabed. Meanwhile, as the sun hangs low over the western horizon, casting long golden fingers across the plains, the inhabitants of this drowned world continue their daily rituals, unaware that the ground beneath them is slowly, inevitably, becoming the floor of a new and rising sea.
The sound of a flint blade striking bone echoes softly through the crisp morning air, a rhythmic, purposeful tapping that marks the beginning of another day in the heart of this vast green expanse. It is a sound that has repeated for generations, yet it is one that the modern world has only recently begun to hear again, whispered through the silt and salt of the North Sea. These are the first footsteps of the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, the nomadic wanderers of the Middle Stone Age, a period beginning roughly 10,000 years ago, when the ice had retreated and the world was coming back to life in a riot of birch and hazel. As the great ice sheets groaned and pulled back toward the poles, they left behind a fertile, virgin landscape, and into this vacuum stepped the pioneers. They did not arrive as conquerors, but as participants in a complex, living system. Following the ancient game trails that crisscrossed the plains, these small bands of humans moved with a grace born of deep intimacy with their surroundings. They were not merely passing through. They were becoming part of the land itself. To look upon Doggerland during this era is to see a world where the boundaries between humanity and nature were as thin as the morning mist clinging to the reeds of a marsh. Their lives were dictated by the seasons, a slow and steady pulse that governed every movement and every decision. In the spring, when the rivers swelled with meltwater and the first green shoots pierced the thawing earth, they would follow the migrations of the red deer and the roe deer. These animals were the lifeblood of the community, providing not just meat, but hide for clothing, bone for needles, and antler for the specialized harpoons used to pull pike from the slow-moving streams. As the heat of summer settled over the plains, the groups might move toward the higher ground or the cooling breezes of the distant, encroaching coast, gathering wild hazelnuts and berries, their fingers stained purple by the bounty of the forest floor. We know of their presence not through grand monuments or stone cities, for they built nothing intended to outlast their stay, but through the humble debris of their daily existence. Deep beneath the modern shipping lanes, where the light of the sun never reaches, the seabed holds the secrets of their temporary camps. Here, archaeologists have recovered thousands of microliths, tiny, exquisitely worked shards of flint, often no larger than a fingernail. These were the multi-tools of the Mesolithic world, glued into wooden or bone shafts with birch resin to create serrated spears, arrows, and scraping tools. Each piece of flint tells a story of a moment in time, a hunter repairing a spear by a dying fire, a woman scraping a hide while children played in the tall grass. The evidence of these camps is often found in the most unlikely of ways. Trawlers dragging their nets across the Dogger bank have occasionally pulled up more than just fish. Among the cod and the silt, they have found worked wood, blackened by millennia of submersion, and the bones of wild boar that still bear the telltale marks of butchery. These artifacts are the ghosts of a nomadic lifestyle that valued mobility above all else. A camp might be occupied for only a few weeks before the group moved on, leaving behind little more than a circle of charred earth and a few discarded stone flakes. Yet, in the silent stratigraphy, the layers of soil and sediment that build up over time, these fragments remain as a testament to a people who walked where the whales now swim. To understand these early humans, one must imagine a deep spiritual connection to the rhythms of the land, a way of being that saw no distinction between the self and the forest. They understood the language of the wind in the willow trees and the subtle shifts in the scent of the air that signaled a coming storm. Their world was one of constant flux, where the rivers changed their course and the forests expanded and contracted with the centuries. They were masters of adaptation, possessing a sophisticated knowledge of botany and animal behavior that would put modern survivalists to shame. They knew which roots could heal a fever and which fungi could carry a spark from one campfire to the next, and yet, for all their skill, they were living on a clock they could not see. The very environment that sustained them was built upon a foundation of shifting sands. As they tracked the great elk through the dense thickets of oak and elm, the global climate was warming. This was the era of the Holocene, our current geological epoch, but its beginning was marked by a dramatic rise in sea levels as the remaining glacial ice melted into the oceans. For the people of the drowned forest, this change was likely imperceptible on the scale of a single human life. Perhaps a favorite fishing spot became a little saltier over a decade, or a coastal path was submerged during a particularly high spring tide, never to emerge again. They lived in the long now, a state of existence where the past and the future were mirrored in the recurring cycles of the moon and the migrations of the birds. There was no concept of a lost land, for the land was simply what it was in that moment. They adjusted their territories, moving their hearths a few hundred yards inland every few generations, perhaps telling stories of ancestors who once walked on ground that was now the domain of the grey seal. These stories, passed down through oral tradition, may have been the first inklings of a changing world, whispered around fires as the waves crept ever closer to the heart of their home. The sophistication of their flint knapping and their ability to navigate such a vast, featureless plain suggests a culture of high intelligence and social cohesion. They were not the primitive cavemen of popular imagination, but a resilient and creative people who had mastered one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. The marshes and estuaries of Doggerland were a paradise of biodiversity, offering a calorie-rich diet that supported healthy, robust populations. In the quiet of the evening, as the shadows of the trees stretched out like long, dark fingers across the grass, one can almost hear the low murmur of their voices, discussing the day's hunt or the path they would take when the leaves began to turn. As the centuries rolled into millennia, the heart of Doggerland remained a sanctuary, a vast lowland bridge connecting what we now call Britain to the European mainland. It was a corridor of life, a place of meeting and exchange where different bands of hunters might cross paths, trading high-quality flint from the chalk downs for amber gathered from the distant Baltic shores. These encounters were the threads that wove the human story together, creating a shared culture that spanned thousands of miles of forest and fen. But the sea is a patient hunter. While the Mesolithic people perfected their crafts and raised their children in the shelter of the woods, the North Sea was slowly reclaiming its ancient territory. The deep connection these humans felt to the land was being challenged by a force they could neither influence nor fully comprehend. The rhythms they followed, the deer, the boar, the ripening of the hazelnut, were all being pushed further and further toward the higher ground. The first footsteps that had once wandered so freely across the center of the plain were now being funneled into narrowing corridors of dry land. We are left to contemplate the silence of those submerged camps, where the flint tools still lie nestled in the peat, exactly where they were dropped 8,000 years ago. They are frozen in time, preserved by the very water that displaced their makers. It is a haunting thought that beneath the churning grey waves of the modern North Sea there are hearths that have not felt the heat of a flame for 80 centuries, yet they remain, waiting for the light of discovery to find them once more. The story of these early humans is not one of disappearance, but of a long, slow retreat, a testament to the enduring spirit of a species that has always found a way to walk, even as the ground disappears beneath its feet. Imagine, if you will, the scent of wild garlic and damp earth carried on a breeze that has never known the salt of a distant ocean. To those who lived there, this was not a land on the brink of a deluge, nor was it a temporary bridge between continents. It was simply the center of the world. Archaeologists often look back at Doggerland and see a Garden of Eden for prehistoric Europe, a term that carries the weight of a lost paradise. Yet for the Mesolithic people, it was a reality of such immense natural wealth that the concept of scarcity might have felt entirely foreign. The landscape was a mosaic of life, a sprawling tapestry of wetlands, lagoons, and winding river valleys that offered a bounty so consistent it allowed for a way of life far more settled than we once believed possible. While the rest of the continent was often defined by the harshness of high mountains or the dense, dark shadows of inland forests, the great plain of the North Sea was a place of light and water. The estuaries, where the great rivers like the Rhine and the Thames once met in a slow, meandering dance, were the heart of this abundance. Here, the rhythm of life was dictated by the tides and the seasons. One can almost hear the soft splash of a woven basket being lowered into the shallows, the sound of laughter echoing across the reeds as families gathered shellfish by the thousands. Oysters, mussels, and cockles were not delicacies here. They were the reliable foundation of a diet that required no hunting, no pursuit, only the patience to reach down into the cool, clear silt. As the spring sun warmed the shallow waters, the rivers would begin to shimmer with the silver scales of salmon and trout migrating upstream. These were not merely fish, but a seasonal miracle, a concentrated surge of energy that could be harvested with nets made of lime-bast fibre or trapped in intricate weirs of willow. The ease of this harvest meant that time, that most precious of human commodities, was available in surplus. When the belly is full and the hearth is warm, the mind begins to turn toward other things, toward the crafting of more beautiful tools, the telling of longer stories, and the building of connections that spanned the horizon. This landscape of plenty likely gave rise to social structures far more complex than the simple, wandering bands of hunters we often imagine. In a land where a single estuary could support dozens of families for an entire season, the need for constant movement diminished. We see evidence of this in the archaeological record, in the sheer density of flint tools and the remains of seasonal camps that suggest these people returned to the same sacred patches of ground for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. It was a world of landmarks. Perhaps a particularly ancient oak tree stood at the confluence of two rivers, or a high ridge of chalk offered a view across the marshlands to the distant hills of what is now England. These were the places of gathering, the seasonal cathedrals where different groups would meet to trade, to find partners, and to share the news of the wide, green world. One can visualize a great summer gathering on a rise of dry ground overlooking a vast lagoon. The air would be thick with the smell of roasting venison and the sweet, earthy aroma of gathered tubers. There would be the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of flint knapping, the skilled hands of a master crafter shaping a microlith, a tiny, razor-sharp stone flake used to tip a harpoon or a spear. In this era, the mastery of the environment was not achieved through force, but through an intimate, granular understanding of its cycles. They knew exactly when the hazelnuts would be ready for gathering in the woodland fringes, and exactly when the migratory birds would darken the sky in their millions, landing in the marshes to rest. There is a certain peace in reflecting on this level of harmony. In the modern world, we often view nature as something to be managed or overcome, but for the inhabitants of the drowned forest, nature was a generous host. The relative ease of life in such a fertile landscape meant that the struggle for survival was, for a time, replaced by the art of living. This abundance likely fostered a culture of deep spiritual connection to the land. When every stream provides water, every thicket provides fruit, and every river provides silver-scaled life, the world itself feels like a sentient, giving entity. We find hints of this in the rare artifacts that have survived the salt and the silt. A carved piece of antler, a pendant made from a wolf's tooth, or a finely worked bone needle. These were not just utilitarian objects, they were expressions of a people who had the time to appreciate beauty. As the years passed, these social gatherings likely became the anchors of their identity. Imagine the stories told around the fires during those long, prehistoric evenings, stories of the great river that flowed to the edge of the world, or of the ancestors who first followed the retreating ice northwards. These were a people of the water. Their highways were the creeks and channels, navigated in dugout canoes carved from the trunks of massive lime trees. To them, the water was not an enemy or a barrier, but a provider and a path. They moved through the landscape with a lightness of touch, leaving behind hearths and homes that would one day be buried by the very element that sustained them. There is a haunting beauty in the thought of these large, peaceful gatherings. We often think of prehistoric life as nasty, brutish, and short, but the evidence from Doggerland suggests something quite different. It suggests a period of stability and wealth that might have lasted for 4,000 years, a span of time longer than the history of most modern empires. During this golden age of the Mesolithic, the population of the North Sea plain likely flourished, creating a vibrant, interconnected network of communities that shared ideas and technologies across hundreds of miles of fertile ground. But even in a land of such abundance, the subtle signs of change would have been there for those who knew how to look. Perhaps an old woman, sitting by the shore where her grandmother once sat, noticed that the high tide mark was just a few inches further up the bank than it used to be. Perhaps a hunter found that a favourite path through the marshes was now permanently underwater, requiring a detour through the higher woods. These changes were slow, so slow they would have been invisible to a single generation, yet they were the first ripples of a transformation that would eventually rewrite the map of the world. For now, however, the sun sets over a landscape that is vast, green, and teeming with life. The smoke from a dozen hearths rises straight into the still evening air, marking the locations of families settling in for the night. There is no sense of urgency, no fear of the horizon. The rivers are full, the forests are thick with game, and the estuaries are a larder that never runs dry. It is a moment of profound equilibrium, a time when humanity and the earth existed in a state of grace that we can now only glimpse through the murky lens of deep time and the occasional treasure brought up in a fisherman's net. The Great Plain was not just a bridge between places, it was a destination in itself, a sovereign kingdom of reeds and water that remains, in our collective memory, a phantom image of a world where everything was provided. As we contemplate the richness of this lost world, we must wonder how their social structures adapted to such plenty. Did they have leaders, or were they guided by the collective wisdom of the elders who remembered the cycles of the moon and the migrations of the deer? The archaeological record remains tantalizingly silent on the specifics, yet the sheer scale of the remains suggests a society that was healthy, robust, and deeply settled. They were the masters of the wetlands, a people who had turned the edge of the world into a home of unparalleled comfort. And as the twilight deepens over the prehistoric North Sea, we are left to marvel at the thought of a civilization that flourished in a garden that no longer exists, a place where the ground was steady, the water was a friend, and the bounty of the earth felt as though it would last forever. The scent of the air began to change almost before the people noticed the shifting of the horizon. It was a subtle transformation, a slow creeping infusion of brine into the sweet, earthy fragrance of the deep woodland. For thousands of years, the great oaks and elms had stood as silent guardians of a vast continental interior. But now a new element was whispering through the leaves. The global climate was continuing its long, steady thaw, and the great ice sheets far to the north were weeping into the oceans, sending a slow-motion pulse of water across the globe. This was not a sudden deluge, not a wall of water that arrived in a single afternoon, but rather a patient, relentless advance that moved with the pace of a shadow stretching across a sundial. As the years passed, the low-lying forests began to feel the breath of the sea on their roots. It started in the hollows and the dips of the land, where the freshwater streams found they could no longer drain away into the distance. Instead, the water began to pool, turning the dark forest floor into a mirror of the sky. At first, it might have seemed like a particularly wet season, or a decade of heavy rains, but the water did not recede. The salt began to seep into the groundwater, a silent poison to the ancient trees that had known only the purity of the rain. One by one, the great giants of the wood began to die, their bark turning silver and brittle, their leaves failing to sprout in the spring. They became a forest of ghosts, bleached skeletons standing in a rising tide of silt and reeds. The lush green canopy gave way to the pale swaying grasses of the salt marshes. Where once the deer had moved through the shadows of the timber, now the wading birds picked their way through the shallow lagoons. The geography of the world was softening, blurring at the edges as the solid earth dissolved into a labyrinth of tidal creeks and mudflats. For the people who lived there, this was a transformation of their very reality. Imagine the psychological weight of such a change. To stand upon a hill that your great-grandfather called the heart of the world, only to see it become an island, and then a mere sandbar visible only at low tide. There is a deep, quiet sorrow in watching the map of your childhood slowly erased by the grey waters of the North Sea. Generations of families would have lived through this slow-motion catastrophe, perhaps moving their hearths back by only a few yards every decade. To them, the sea was a living thing, a hungry deity that demanded tribute in the form of land. They would have told stories of the old woods that now lay beneath the waves, places where their ancestors once hunted, but where now only the fish darted between the submerged roots. This was the loss of a collective memory, a physical unmooring from the places that gave their culture its meaning. The landmarks were vanishing. The sacred groves were being swallowed. The very ground beneath their feet was proving to be a temporary gift. Meanwhile, further to the south and west, a more profound separation was beginning to take shape. For millennia, a high ridge of chalk had connected the cliffs of what we now call Dover to the shores of France. This was the great land bridge, the umbilical cord that tied the British peninsula to the heart of the European continent. It was a massive, solid barrier that kept the waters of the Atlantic and the North Sea apart. But as the sea levels rose, the pressure on this natural dam became immense. The water began to overtop the ridge, spilling over in small rivulets that grew into roaring cascades. This process of stratigraphy, the study of the layers of the earth, tells us that the formation of the English Channel was not just a geological event, but a profound shift in the human story. As the water carved through the soft chalk, it created a permanent breach. The land bridge was failing. What had once been a vast, contiguous plain where a traveller could walk from the mountains of Central Europe all the way to the highlands of Scotland without ever seeing the sea was now being severed. The English Channel was beginning to yawn open, a widening gulf of cold, churning water that would eventually turn Britain into an island. The people living on the edges of this disappearing world must have felt the earth shrinking beneath them. The paths they had walked for centuries were being cut off. The migrations of the animals they relied upon were being redirected or halted entirely. There is a haunting quality to this era, a sense of a world being dismantled piece by piece. The land was not just being covered, it was being reclaimed by an older, more primordial power. The North Sea was asserting its dominance, filling the basin of Doggerland with a steady, quiet confidence. As the salt marshes expanded, the lifestyle of the inhabitants had to shift once again. They became even more reliant on their canoes, their lives governed entirely by the rhythm of the tides. The drowned forest was no longer a place of mystery. It was their everyday reality. They lived in a world of liminality, a place that was neither truly land nor truly sea. It was a landscape of transition, where the horizon was always moving, always creeping closer to the firelight of their camps. They were the last witnesses to a continent's end, the final inhabitants of a country that was destined to become a legend. One can almost hear the sound of the waves hitting the shore, a sound that grew louder and more persistent with every passing century. It was the sound of the future arriving, bringing with it an end to the age of the land bridge and the beginning of the age of the sea. The trees that had stood for 500 years finally toppled into the muck, covered by layers of silt and sand that would preserve them for 10,000 years until a modern trawler's net would snag on their stony remains. These are the submerged forests that coastal wanderers still find today at very low tides. Dark, peat-filled stumps that emerge from the sand like the teeth of a buried giant. They serve as a silent testament to the scale of what was lost. Each stump is a marker of a specific moment in time when the water finally won, and as we look out over the grey expanse of the modern North Sea, it is difficult to grasp the sheer volume of land that lies beneath. Hundreds of thousands of square miles of valley, forest and plain, all gone. The geography we take for granted today is merely the high ground that survived the deluge. We are living on the mountain peaks of a sunken world. The loss of the land bridge changed the destiny of everyone who remained on the northern side of the breach. They were now islanders, separated from the rest of the world by a moat of salt water. The cultural exchange that had flowed so freely across the plains was now filtered through the dangers of a sea crossing. The very concept of home had to be redefined. No longer was it a vast, endless expanse. It was now a defined space bounded by the waves. The psychological shift must have been profound, a transition from a world of infinite horizons to a world of shores. As the climate continued to warm, the last remnants of the great Doggerland hills became islands themselves, small, lonely outcrops in a rising sea. For a time, people likely continued to visit them, perhaps using them as seasonal fishing camps or sacred sites for burying their dead. But eventually, even these islands grew too small to support life. The water continued its ascent, driven by the melting of the distant glaciers, until the highest points of the land were nothing more than treacherous shoals beneath the surf. The story of the encroaching tide is a story of patience. It reminds us that the earth is never truly static, that the boundaries of our world are written in water as much as in stone. The people of the drowned forest did not leave behind grand monuments or written histories, but they left behind something perhaps more evocative: their absence. They left a void where a civilization once stood, a silence that now stretches for miles beneath the shipping lanes. As we sleep, the same tides that moved their world continue to ebb and flow, a rhythmic reminder of the deep time that swallows all things in the end.
Imagine a single sharp crack echoing through the deep, cold canyons of the Norwegian Sea, a sound that no human ear heard, yet one that signaled the end of a world. Deep beneath the surface, where the continental shelf begins its long, steep descent into the abyss, the earth itself grew weary of its own weight. It was approximately 8,200 years ago, in a time we now call 6,200 BC, when a staggering mass of sediment over 700 miles of underwater hillside simply gave way. This was the Storegga Slide, a name derived from the Norwegian for the Great Edge, and it remains one of the largest underwater landslides known to history. As the seabed collapsed, it did not merely settle. It roared downward, displacing trillions of tons of water in a matter of moments. The ocean, usually a slow and rhythmic giant, was suddenly jolted into a state of violent kinetic energy. A series of waves began to radiate outward from the site of the collapse, travelling with the speed of a modern jet aircraft across the darkening North Sea. These were not the rolling swells that sailors find familiar, but walls of water, massive and unrelenting, fueled by the sheer gravity of the falling earth. In the low-lying basin of Doggerland, the people would have had no warning. Perhaps the first sign was a strange, unsettling retreat of the tide, the water pulling back far beyond the usual low-water mark, exposing shimmering mudflats and gasping fish that had never seen the light of day. For a few minutes, a profound and eerie silence likely hung over the marshes, and then the horizon changed. A dark, foaming line appeared where the sky met the sea, growing taller and louder with every passing heartbeat. When the tsunami struck the coastlines of the drowned forest, it did not arrive as a single wave, but as a succession of surges, some reaching heights of 60 feet or more as they were funneled into the shallowing inlets. The force was unimaginable. It was enough to snap the ancient oaks like dry twigs, and to roll massive boulders inland as if they were pebbles. The water did not just flood the land, it scoured it. The delicate stratigraphy, that layered record of soil and peat that archaeologists use to read the past, was torn apart in an instant. The sea was reclaiming its territory with a sudden brutal finality, washing away the hearths, the tools, and the very footsteps of those who had called the forest home. We can still see the physical scarring of this event today if we know where to look. Along the coastlines of Scotland and the Northern Isles, geologists find thin, distinct layers of sand sandwiched between thick beds of inland peat. These sand layers, often located miles from the modern shore and high above the current sea level, are the fingerprints of the Storegga Slide. They contain the broken shells of deep-sea creatures and the microscopic remains of oceanic life, deposited far inland by a force that defied the natural order of the tides. It is a physical memory of a day when the ocean climbed the hills. For the communities that survived the initial impact, the world they woke to the following morning was unrecognizable. The familiar hunting grounds were gone, replaced by saltwater lagoons and tangled mats of dead vegetation. The freshwater springs were fouled with brine, and the migratory paths of the deer and the elk were severed by new, impassable channels. The Storegga Slide did not merely drown the land, it shattered the delicate ecological balance that had sustained human life for thousands of years. It was a cataclysm that accelerated the inevitable, turning what had been a slow, generational retreat from the rising sea into a sudden, desperate exodus. As the years passed, the waters never truly receded to their former boundaries. The landslide had changed the very shape of the North Sea basin, and the weight of the new water further depressed the land. The forest was gone, replaced by a grey, churning expanse that grew wider with every passing winter storm. The survivors moved to higher ground, to the hills of Britain and the plains of northern Europe, carrying with them perhaps only the fragmented stories of a great wave and a lost world.
In the quiet of the present day, when the North Sea is calm and the fog rolls in over the shipping lanes, it is difficult to imagine the violence of that moment. We look out at the water and see a barrier, a void, a space between nations. But beneath the keels of the passing tankers, the scarred seabed remains, a silent monument to the day the earth slipped. The Storegga slide reminds us that the stability of our world is often an illusion, a brief pause in the long, restless movements of the planet. We walk on ground that feels solid, yet we are always living on the edge of deep time, where the mountains of the sea can crumble in an afternoon, and the maps we draw are only ever written in the shifting sands of the tide. The salt spray carries a different scent now, no longer the crisp fragrance of a distant shoreline, but the heavy, omnipresent weight of an ocean that has claimed the horizon. Where once a traveller could walk from the rolling hills of Yorkshire to the marshy plains of Denmark without ever wetting their feet, there is now only the vast, grey expanse of the North Sea. But beneath these waves, for a few final centuries, a ghost remained. The Storegga tsunami had been a singular, violent catastrophe, a wall of water that redefined the world in a matter of hours, yet it did not quite finish the work of the rising tides. As the surge receded and the debris of shattered forests settled into the silt, a high ridge of land remained defiant. This was the Doggerbank, once the mountainous heart of a subcontinent, now transformed into a lonely, sprawling island, cut off from the rest of the world by leagues of cold, churning water. To look upon the Doggerbank in this era is to witness a world in slow motion retreat. It is a massive island, roughly the size of Wales, or perhaps even larger, but it is an island with no future. The people who find themselves here are the descendants of the great hunters of the plains, the Mesolithic families who once tracked elk and wild cattle across thousands of square miles of open tundra and forest. Now, they are a maritime people by necessity, their lives dictated by the shrinking perimeter of their home. They are the inhabitants of a kingdom that is being stolen by the moon and the melting ice of distant glaciers, a process known to us as eustatic sea level rise, the slow, relentless swelling of the world's oceans as the great ice sheets of the north continue to weep into the sea. Life on this final island is a study in dwindling margins. As the water creeps upward, the freshwater springs that once nourished the valleys begin to turn brackish. The salt finds its way into the groundwater, poisoning the roots of the oak and hazel trees. The great forests, already battered by the tsunami, begin to wither. Standing deadwood, skeletons of silver-grey timber, lines the shorelines, a phenomenon we call ghost forests, where the trees die on their feet, unable to drink the salt that now surrounds them. For the people living here, the loss of the trees is the loss of everything. It is the loss of fuel for the winter fires, the loss of bark for containers, and the loss of the nuts and fruits that provided a vital buffer against the lean months of spring. The animals feel the change first. The great red deer and the wild boars find their grazing lands shrinking every year. On a closed island, there is no room for migration, no way to escape the pressure of a growing population on a diminishing landmass. We see evidence in the archaeological record of island dwarfing in other parts of the world, where large species grow smaller over generations to survive on limited calories. But here, time is moving too fast for evolution to keep pace. The herds grow thin, The hunters, once masters of the vast interior, find themselves spending more and more time on the shore, looking to the sea for the sustenance the land can no longer provide. They become experts in the rhythm of the tides, harvesting shellfish, seals, and the occasional stranded whale, their diet shifting from the rich fats of land mammals to the lean, salty bounty of the cold Atlantic. And so, the culture of the Dogger Bank begins to change, taking on a character of quiet, desperate resilience. This is the last stand of a way of life that had persisted for thousands of years. We can imagine the campfires at night, flickering on the high ridges of the bank, what is now a shallow shoal beneath the keels of fishing trawlers. From these heights, the elders might have pointed toward the south and the east, telling stories of the lands that used to be, of the valleys where their grandfathers hunted, now lost beneath 30 meters of water. There is a profound loneliness in being the last of a people on a disappearing island. Every storm that rolls in from the north carries the threat of further erosion, as the soft glacial clays and sands that form the island are eaten away by the surf. The stratigraphy, the layers of soil and peat that archaeologists study to map this time, tells a story of increasing salinity. We find the remains of freshwater plants being replaced by salt marsh species like glasswort and sea aster. The very chemistry of the earth was changing. As the land area shrank, the human inhabitants were forced into closer and closer quarters. In the beginning, there might have been conflict over the remaining fertile patches, but eventually a different reality must have set in. The realization that the island was no longer a home, but a trap. There is a mystery in the abandonment of the Dogger Bank. Did the people leave all at once, in a great flotilla of dugout canoes, striking out for the rising hills of Britain or the coasts of the Netherlands? Or was it a slow, agonizing fade, a process of attrition where fewer and fewer children were born, and the last few inhabitants lived out their days as hermits on a crumbling cliffside? The evidence is difficult to find, buried as it is beneath meters of shifting sand and the crushing weight of the North Sea. Yet occasionally the sea gives up a secret, a barbed harpoon point carved from antler, a fragment of a human skull, a worked piece of flint. These items are pulled up in the nets of fishermen, snagged from the drowned surface of the bank. They are often worn smooth by the water, polished by thousands of years of tidal movement, but they remain as silent witnesses to those final generations. As the years passed, the high ground of the Dogger Bank became untenable. The weather in the middle of the North Sea is unforgiving. Without the protection of a vast landmass to break the wind, the island would have been raked by gales and shrouded in freezing mists. The soil, once rich and loamy, became a sodden, salty mire. One can imagine the final inhabitants standing on the highest point of the island, the very top of the bank, watching the horizon. To the west, the distant, hazy blue line of the British hills might have been visible on a clear day, a reminder of a world that still stood firm. The departure, when it finally came, marked the end of an era. The Dogger Bank was more than just a piece of geography. It was the final redoubt of a Mesolithic world that had existed since the end of the last great ice age. When the last fire was extinguished on those heights and the last canoe pushed off into the surf, the North Sea finally became a true sea, an unbroken expanse of water separating the British Isles from the continent. The island did not vanish overnight, of course. For a time, it would have remained a series of shifting sandbars and treacherous shoals, a graveyard for any creature caught in the tides. But eventually, even the highest dunes were overtopped. The waves smoothed over the scars of the campsites, the middens of shells, and the graves of the ancestors. Today, when we look at maps of the North Sea floor, we see the Dogger Bank as a vast underwater plateau. It remains a place of great biological productivity, a shallow area where sunlight reaches deep into the water, fueling the growth of plankton and supporting vast schools of fish. In a way, The bank is still a source of life, just as it was 8,000 years ago. But the life it supports now is cold and rhythmic, governed by the currents rather than the seasons of the forest. We are only just beginning to use modern technology, sub-bottom profiling and side-scan sonar, to peer through the silt and see the river valleys and hills that still exist in the topography of the seabed. We are looking at a map of a world that was never meant to be forgotten, a landscape that was walked by people who were, in every biological sense, exactly like us. They had the same fears, the same loves, and the same desperate desire to hold on to the places they called home, even as the earth itself seemed to dissolve beneath their feet. The story of the final islands of Doggerland is a reminder of the fragility of the familiar. It challenges our perception of the eternal nature of our coastlines, and reminds us that the maps we draw today are merely a single frame in a very long, very restless movie. As we drift closer to sleep, we can almost hear the sound of those final waves, the slow rhythmic pulse of a sea that takes what it wants, and the enduring silence of a land that once was and is no more. Imagine a single, heavy drop of salt water falling from the leaf of a birch tree. For thousands of years, the leaves of Doggerland had known only the sweet, clear moisture of the rain and the morning mist. But now, the character of the air has changed. The wind carries a sharper scent, a bracing tang of brine that speaks of an approaching horizon. By the year 5000 before the Common Era, the great struggle between the land and the sea reaches its quiet, inevitable conclusion. The final ridges of the Dogger Bank, once the high spine of a continent, have become nothing more than a series of shrinking mounds of mud and grass, huddled against the grey expanse of the North Sea. There is no sudden, cinematic catastrophe in this final hour, but rather a patient, rhythmic drowning. Each high tide reaches a few inches further than the last, claiming a rabbit burrow here, a cluster of wildflowers there, until the very heart of the hills is breached. The water does not merely cover the land, it consumes it, folding the geography into its dark, cold embrace. As the last patches of dry earth vanish beneath the waves, a profound silence settles over the territory. The cries of the inland birds are replaced by the lonely call of the gull, and the rustle of the wind through the reeds is silenced by the muffled weight of the deep. This is the moment of final submergence, when the map of Europe is rewritten by the tides, and the bridge that once allowed humans to walk from the mouth of the Rhine to the cliffs of Yorkshire is broken forever. But the story of the forest does not end with its drowning. In many ways, its preservation begins at the very moment of its death. As the North Sea claims the land, it brings with it vast quantities of silt and fine sand, carried by the churning currents of the newly formed English Channel and the northern depths. This sediment acts as a heavy, suffocating blanket. It settles over the fallen trunks, the tangled roots, and the leaf-strewn floors of the ancient valleys. Because the water is cold and the silt is thick, the oxygen that usually fuels decay is shut out. In this anaerobic world, a place without air, the normal processes of rot and disappearance are suspended. The landscape is not destroyed. It is merely paused, held in a state of icy suspension beneath the seabed. The living green world is transformed into what maritime archaeologists often call a ghost forest. It is a haunting thought to consider that beneath the keels of modern fishing trawlers and the massive foundations of wind turbines, there lies a drowned wilderness that still retains the shape of its former life. The wood does not petrify into stone, nor does it dissolve into nothingness. Instead, it becomes peat, a dense, dark material that holds the chemical signature of the world as it was 7,000 years ago. Within these layers of compressed organic matter, the stratigraphy, or the vertical record of time written in the earth, remains remarkably intact. A single core sample taken from the bottom of the North Sea can reveal a vertical timeline of thousands of years, showing the transition from a frozen tundra to a lush forest, and finally to the salt marsh that signaled the end. As the centuries turn into millennia, the weight of the ocean grows. The tides pile more sand over the remains, creating a tomb that is miles wide and hundreds of feet deep in places. For 5,000 years, this world remains utterly forgotten. The humans who once hunted among these trees become legends, and then their legends fade into the mist of prehistory, leaving no written record of the land they lost. The North Sea becomes a highway for Vikings, a battlefield for empires, and a source of wealth for modern nations, yet all the while the forest waits in the dark. It is a landscape of shadows, where the roots of oak trees still grip the soil of a continent that no longer exists. There is a strange, heavy peace in this deep sleep. In the terrestrial world, forests are dynamic and fleeting. They burn, they are cleared by the axe, or they succumb to the changing climate. But the drowned forest of the North Sea is protected by its own demise. It is shielded from the fire and the wind, locked away in a vault of silt where time moves differently. The silence that settled over the land in 5,000 before the Common Era is a thick, liquid silence, a stillness that has lasted longer than the entirety of recorded human civilization. We often think of the sea as a place of erosion, a force that grinds rocks into sand and washes away the traces of the past. Yet here, the water has acted as a curator. By submerging Doggerland, the sea saved it from the ravages of the modern world. It preserved the delicate remains of insects, the fragile casings of seeds, and even the footprints of the people who once walked here, pressed into the mud of a riverbank that hasn't seen the sun in 7 millennia. As we contemplate this vast, underwater museum, we begin to realize that the earth does not forget. It merely hides its memories in the places we are least likely to look. The transformation from a vibrant, breathing ecosystem to a submerged relic is a slow, ghostly process. Imagine the trees standing tall even after they have died, their branches reaching upward through the murky water until the weight of the barnacles and the pull of the currents finally brings them down. They fall softly into the mud, becoming part of the seabed, their timber turning black and hard like ebony. This is the deep sleep of the North Sea, a state of being that is neither fully gone nor truly present. It is a world of echoes, waiting for a stray anchor or a shifting current to reveal a single, salt-soaked branch, a lonely messenger from a time when the North Sea was a valley and the world was green as far as the eye could see. Imagine the heavy, rhythmic creak of a wooden trawler labouring against the grey swells of the North Sea in the early years of the 20th century. The air is thick with salt and the sharp scent of cold water, and the sun is a pale, indistinct smudge behind a veil of mist. For generations, the fishermen of the East Anglian coast and the lowlands of the Netherlands viewed the seabed as a flat, featureless wasteland, a source of livelihood certainly, but a place devoid of history. Their nets were meant for cod and herring, for the silver scales that shimmered in the morning light. But as the industrial age brought larger vessels and heavier gear, the nets began to reach deeper, scraping the very floor of the ocean, and they started bringing up things that had no business being in the salt water. At first, these oddities were seen as nuisances. A fisherman might pull his net onto the deck, expecting the weight of a heavy catch, only to find a massive blackened tooth the size of a man's fist, or a strange, fossilized bone that looked like it belonged to a giant. They found lumps of what they called moorlog, a dark, compressed peat that smelled faintly of ancient decay and burned with a steady, smoky flame in their cabin stoves. They did not know then that they were burning the remains of a prehistoric forest, or that the teeth belonged to woolly mammoths that had once thundered across a plain, where now only silence and pressure exist. The sea, in its vast and patient way, was beginning to cough up the fragments of a lost world, one piece at a time, tangled in the twine of a common fishing net. As these curiosities accumulated on the docks and in the back rooms of coastal museums, a quiet realization began to dawn upon the scholars and archaeologists of the time. They looked at these fragments, the birch bark, the hazelnut shells, the massive molars of Ice Age beasts, and they began to see a pattern. The North Sea was not just a body of water, it was a drowned landscape. It was a realization that shifted the very foundation of how we understood human history. It suggested that for thousands of years, the center of European life was not on the edges of the continent, but in a place that had since become unreachable. The sea had acted as a protective museum, a cold and anaerobic vault that shielded organic materials from the ravages of oxygen and bacteria, preserving the delicate story of a people who had no written language. The most profound of these accidental discoveries occurred in the September of 1932, aboard a trawler named the Colinda. As the vessel worked the shallow waters of the Leman and Ower banks, some 25 miles off the coast of Norfolk, the crew hauled up a particularly heavy lump of moorlog. When they broke the peat apart, they found something that stopped them in their tracks. A long, slender point made of bone, intricately carved with a series of sharp barbs. It was a harpoon, elegant and deadly, still as sharp as the day it was fashioned. This was not the bone of a random animal. This was the work of a human hand. The Colinda harpoon, as it came to be known, was a revelation. It proved beyond any doubt that humans had not just visited these lands, but had lived there, hunted there, and left their tools behind. When the harpoon was subjected to the scrutiny of science, it told a story of deep time, through the study of stratigraphy, the layering of the earth that acts as a clock for those who know how to read it, and eventually through the miracle of radiocarbon dating, which measures the slow decay of carbon atoms to pinpoint an object's age. The harpoon was dated to the early Mesolithic period. It was approximately 12,000 years old. This placed it in the wake of the Younger Dryas, a brief and bitter return to glacial conditions that had gripped the world just before the climate began to warm in earnest. The harpoon was a bridge across the millennia, a tangible link to a hunter who had stood on a riverbank that now lies dozens of meters beneath the waves. The significance of the moorlog itself cannot be overstated. To an archaeologist, a lump of peat is a library. Within its dark, compressed layers are trapped the microscopic grains of pollen from every tree, flower and grass that grew in that spot thousands of years ago. By analyzing this pollen, researchers were able to reconstruct the entire ecosystem of the North Sea plain. They saw the transition from a cold, treeless tundra to a lush forest of birch and pine, and eventually to a dense woodland of oak and elm. They could see the world warming, the ice melting, and the tide slowly, inexorably rising. The sea had not just taken the land, it had embalmed it. And so, the image of the North Sea began to transform in the collective imagination. It was no longer a barrier between Britain and the continent, but a heartland, a vast, fertile plain that archaeologists began to call Doggerland, named after the Dogger Bank, where so many of these finds originated. It was a place of wide, slow-moving rivers and shallow lakes, a landscape that would have been a paradise for the wandering bands of the Middle Stone Age. The fishermen, with their nets full of teeth and tools, were the first to touch the ghosts of this civilization. They were pulling up the floorboards of a house that had been submerged for 8,000 years, reminding us that the geography we take for granted is merely a temporary arrangement, a brief pause in the long, shifting history of the earth. To see what lies beneath the waves, we must learn to look through the eyes of machines, translating the cold echoes of the deep into a language of light and shadow. For decades, the North Sea remained a vast grey mystery, a liquid veil that hid the secrets of the Mesolithic world from our sight. But beneath the churning surface, a different kind of exploration was taking place, driven not by the curiosity of historians, but by the relentless search for energy. Oil and gas companies, in their quest to map the strata of the earth, began to send pulses of sound deep into the seabed. These seismic waves travelled through the water and the silt, bouncing off the hard rock and the ancient clay, returning to the surface as data, a digital fingerprint of a world that had not seen the sun in nearly 10,000 years. It was Professor Vince Gaffney and his team at the University of Bradford who realized that within this massive archive of industrial data lay the blueprint for a lost continent. Through the Doggerland project, they began the painstaking work of repurposing these seismic surveys, peeling back the layers of ocean and sediment as if they were turning the pages of a waterlogged book. They were looking for more than just mineral deposits. They were looking for the ghosts of geography. By analyzing the way sound waves reflected off the various densities of the earth, they began to trace the outlines of things that should not exist in the middle of a sea. They found the winding curves of riverbeds, the jagged edges of cliffs, and the gentle slopes of hills that once overlooked fertile plains. Imagine a room filled with the soft hum of computers, where the flickering screens reveal a landscape emerging from the darkness. As the algorithms process the data, a map begins to form, not a map of the modern world, but a three-dimensional reconstruction of a territory that hasn't been walked upon since the ice retreated. This digital modelling allows us to see the topography of Doggerland with a clarity that borders on the surreal. We see the great Ouse and the Rhine as they once were, not as the separate entities we know today, but as part of a massive interconnected river system that drained the heart of Europe. We see the valleys where the mist would have gathered in the early morning, and the high ridges where a hunter might have stood, watching the migration of red deer across the horizon. These are the hills and dales that have been invisible for eons, preserved in a state of suspended animation by the very salt water that claimed them. Through this mapping, we can follow the path of a stream as it meanders through a forest of birch and pine, its banks perhaps lined with the small, temporary camps of the people who followed the seasons. We can see the depressions in the earth where great lakes once stood, their waters still and clear, reflecting a sky that was shared by the ancestors of everyone living in Britain and northern Europe today. It is a strange sensation to realize that the deep, silent trenches of the North Sea were once the vibrant, noisy centres of human life, filled with the sound of wind in the leaves and the distant call of a wolf. The work of Professor Gaffney and his colleagues is a form of time travel, a way of reclaiming a history that was thought to be lost to the abyss. By using three-dimensional mapping, they have created a virtual world where we can walk through the valleys of the past, seeing the world as it appeared before the Great Flood. They have identified the inner silver pit, a deep depression that was once a massive lake, and the Dogger Bank itself, which would have been a high, windswept plateau, a final refuge for the creatures and people as the waters began to rise. Every line on these digital maps represents a real place, a place where children played, where fires were lit, and where the dead were laid to rest in the cool earth. There is a patient mystery in these images, a sense that we are looking at something we were never meant to see again. The seismic data reveals the stratigraphy, the layers of time, showing us how the landscape changed as the climate shifted. We see the evidence of the Younger Dryas, a period of sudden, intense cold that gripped the world just before the final warming, recorded in the way the sediment settled in the ancient riverbeds. It is a reminder that the earth is a living, breathing entity, constantly reshaping itself, burying its past so that new life can take root. The digital models don't just show us where the land was. They show us how it felt to move through it, the way the terrain dictated the movements of every living thing. As we gaze at these reconstructions, we are forced to confront the limits of our own knowledge. We can map the rivers, but we cannot hear the water. We can trace the outlines of the forests, but we cannot smell the damp earth or the scent of pine needles on a summer afternoon. The technology gives us the skeleton of a world, but the spirit remains elusive, hidden in the gaps between the data points. We are left with a profound sense of scale, a realization that our current geography is merely a snapshot in a much longer, more complex story. The North Sea is not just a body of water. It is a graveyard of a civilization, a place where the memory of the land is kept safe by the pressure of the deep. And so, the invisible becomes visible. The valleys that have been drowned for 8,000 years are brought back into the light, if only on a glowing screen in a quiet laboratory. We see the beauty of a landscape that was perfectly tuned to the needs of its inhabitants, a place of abundance and variety that supported thousands of generations. The work of modern marine archaeology is a quiet rebellion against the passage of time, an insistence that even the most forgotten places deserve to be remembered. It tells us that beneath the waves, the earth still remembers the touch of human feet, and that if we listen closely to the echoes of the sound waves, we can still hear the heartbeat of a lost world. The silence of the North Sea is not an empty one, but rather a heavy, liquid weight pressing down upon a library of stories that have no words. When we look out across the grey expanse of the water today, it is difficult to grasp that we are looking at a landscape of mourning, a place where the geography of the heart once mapped out valleys, ridges and riverbanks that are now dissolved into the salt and the silt. This drowned world, this Doggerland, serves as a profound mirror held up to our own era, reflecting the fragile relationship between the ground beneath our feet and the shifting whims of a planet in constant motion. It reminds us that the maps we draw today are merely sketches in the sand, temporary agreements between the land and the ocean that can be revoked by the slow, relentless rise of the tides. As we piece together the fragments of this lost world, we begin to see that the story of Doggerland is not just a tale of catastrophe, but a testament to human resilience. These ancient people did not vanish overnight in a single cinematic surge of water. Instead, they lived through a slow-motion transformation that spanned thousands of years. They were a people defined by their ability to move, to adapt, and to listen to the changing language of the earth. When the marshes became too deep, they moved to the ridges. When the salt began to poison the freshwater springs, they followed the retreating tree line. Their survival was a long, quiet negotiation with a changing climate, a testament to the fact that humanity has always been a species of the threshold, living on the edge of what is known and what is becoming. There is a strange, haunting comfort in the realization that the British Isles were once firmly rooted in the breast of the European mainland. The English Channel and the North Sea are, in the grand scale of geological time, relatively recent additions to the world's geography. For the vast majority of human history in this region, there was no overseas. There was only the walk, the long seasonal migration across the undulating plains of the Rhine and the Thames, which were once sister rivers flowing into a shared basin. This interconnectedness is etched into our very DNA, a reminder that the borders we guard so fiercely today are invisible to the earth itself. The flint tools found on the seabed are identical to those found in the caves of the Cheddar Gorge or the riverbanks of the Somme, speaking of a unified culture that breathed the same air and hunted the same herds across a continuous, emerald expanse. Perhaps this is why the memory of lost lands lingers so persistently in the folklore of the West. From the submerged kingdom of Cantre Gwaelod in Welsh myth to the legends of Lyonesse off the coast of Cornwall, or the city of Ys in Brittany,
European culture is saturated with stories of bells ringing beneath the waves and towers glimpsed through the clear water of a calm summer sea. While historians once dismissed these as mere flights of fancy, the discovery of Doggerland suggests that they may be the faint, distorted echoes of a collective trauma. They are the oral stratigraphy of our species, stratigraphy being the way archaeologists study the layers of the earth to understand the passage of time. These myths are the layers of our memory, preserving the moment when the familiar world slipped beneath the surface, leaving behind a void that could only be filled with song and story. When we consider the timeline of Doggerland, we are forced to confront the humbling perspective of deep time. Our modern civilization, with its concrete cities and digital networks, has existed for a mere blink of an eye compared to the 10,000 years that humans spent wandering the plains of the North Sea. We measure our history in centuries, but the Earth measures its history in epochs. The period known as the Holocene, which began roughly 11,700 years ago, saw the final drowning of this world, yet it is but a tiny fragment of the larger story. To stand on a beach in Norfolk today and look out toward the horizon is to look across a graveyard of millennia, a place where the bones of mammoths and the hearths of hunters lie cradled in the dark, cold currents. The lessons of the drowned forest are subtle, whispered through the grain of waterlogged wood and the sharp edge of a worked flint. They tell us that change is the only true constant, and that the stability we perceive in our surroundings is an illusion born of our short lifespans. The earth is a living, breathing entity that inhales and exhales the oceans over vast cycles of warming and cooling. During the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt cooling that occurred nearly 13,000 years ago, the world seemed to hold its breath, freezing the landscape in a grip of ice before the final great thaw began. It was this thaw, this release of the glaciers, that eventually turned the hills of Doggerland into islands, and the islands into memories. As we look toward our own future, the legacy of this lost world takes on a new urgency. We are currently witnessing a rise in sea levels that mirrors the changes experienced by the inhabitants of Doggerland, though the causes and the pace may differ. Their story asks us how we will respond when the maps begin to fail, when the places we call home become the subjects of future archaeology. Will we possess the same quiet courage to adapt, to move and to remember? The people of the North Sea plain did not leave behind great pyramids or written records, but they left behind something perhaps more profound, the proof that life continues, even when the world we know is washed away. There is a specific kind of beauty in this fragility. It lends a sacredness to the present moment, a realization that the landscapes we love are precious because they are not permanent. The oak forests that once stood where the fishing boats now cast their nets were once as solid and eternal as the woods we walk through today. The children who played in the shade of those trees had no way of knowing that their playground would one day be a kingdom of silt and shadows. And yet, through the work of those who dredge the deep and sift through the mud, their presence is felt once more. The bridge between the past and the present is not made of stone, but of curiosity and the refusal to let the silence have the last word. In the end, Doggerland teaches us that we are never truly separate from the earth. We are a part of its rhythms, its rises, and its falls. The water that flows over the drowned campsites is the same water that sustains us today, a continuous cycle that links the ancient hunter to the modern dreamer. As the tide comes in and the waves lap against the shore, they bring with them the faint scent of a world that was once green and vibrant, a world where the horizon was not a line of water, but a path leading home. We are the inheritors of that path, the keepers of a story that is still being written in the sand and the spray. The legacy of the drowned world is not one of sorrow, but of a deep, resonant belonging. It is a reminder that even when the land vanishes,
the spirit of the journey remains. We walk where they walked, even if the ground is now hidden, and we breathe the same salt air that once carried the smoke of their fires. In the long, measured gaze of history, we are all inhabitants of a shifting world, travellers on a landscape that is always, slowly, returning to the sea. As we drift towards sleep, we might imagine the quiet beneath the waves, the stillness of the peat, the preserved roots of the ancient trees, and the soft, rhythmic pulse of a heart that beats beneath the floor of the North Sea, waiting for the tides to turn once more. The water remains. It is the one constant in a story defined by change, a vast and restless shroud that stretches from the jagged fjords of Norway to the chalky cliffs of England. As we return our thoughts to the modern North Sea, we listen to the sound of the waves as they are today, a rhythmic, low-frequency hum that has vibrated through the air for thousands of years. The ships that glide across its surface now, the heavy tankers, the nimble fishing boats, the towering steel platforms of industry, are merely shadows passing over a much older world. Beneath their hulls, in the cold and pressurized dark, lies the silent testimony of Doggerland. It is a realm of drowned forests and forgotten footpaths, a place where the geography of the human heart once found a home among the birch and the willow. We think of the people who walked there, not as primitive shadows, but as ourselves, people who felt the bite of the winter wind, the warmth of a summer afternoon, and the deep, quiet mystery of the stars reflected in a freshwater lagoon. They were the inhabitants of a golden age of abundance, a time when the earth offered up its riches in the form of migrating birds, ripening berries, and the silver flash of fish in shallow streams. They did not know they lived on a vanishing continent. To them, the world was eternal, even as the marshes crept a few inches higher each decade, and the familiar landmarks of their grandfathers slowly dipped beneath the salt spray. We honor them now by remembering that their footsteps, though erased by the tides, were the first to map the soul of the North. They were the pioneers of the edge, the masters of the wetlands, and their legacy is carried in the very DNA of the lands that survived the deluge. There is a profound and lasting comfort to be found in the earth's long cycles of change. To contemplate the drowning of a world is not to contemplate an ending, but a transformation. The North Sea is not a graveyard, but a repository, a vast, cold library, where the pages are made of peat and the ink is the silt of 10,000 years. The rising of the waters and the falling of the land are part of a breath the planet takes over eons, a slow and steady inhalation and exhalation that spans the rise and fall of entire civilizations. As we lie here in the stillness of the night, we can feel our own breath sinking with that larger rhythm. The world has changed before, and it will change again, and there is a peace in knowing that we are part of that shifting tapestry. The ancient trees that now rest beneath the seabed were once Sids in the wind. The valleys where the mammoth roamed are now the playgrounds of the whale and the seal. The weight of the water above the drowned forest is not heavy. It is a blanket, a protective layer that keeps the past safe from the ravages of the air and the sun. It is a quietude that surpasses our understanding. As the light of the day fades and the room grows dim, we imagine the water rolling overhead, soft, blue, and infinite. We feel the gentle pressure of the depths, a cool and soothing weight that anchors us to the present while letting our minds wander back into the mist of the Mesolithic. The ships above are far away, their engines a mere whisper, their lights like distant stars seen through a thick fog. Down here, amongst the preserved roots of the oaks and the smooth stones of the ancient riverbeds, there is only the slow, eternal pulse of the tide. The North Sea is a mirror, reflecting both what we were and what we might become. It reminds us that nothing is truly lost, only moved, only hidden for a time until the currents shift once more.
As the waves continue their tireless work of erosion and deposition, we find ourselves drifting, moving with the current of sleep. The boundaries between the land and the sea begin to blur. The sound of the wind in the trees becomes the sound of the surf on the shore, and the rustle of the leaves becomes the hiss of the foam on the sand. We are travelling back now through the layers of time, past the age of iron and bronze, past the first farmers and the builders of stone circles, until we reach that quiet, wooded plain where the smoke of a single fire rises into a clear, prehistoric sky. The air is cool and smells of damp earth and wood smoke.
The forest is vast and full of life, and as we close our eyes, we step into that woods, feeling the soft moss beneath our feet and the deep, unshakable peace of a world that is whole. The water rolls over the Dogger bank. It rolls over the brown bank and the silver pit. It rolls over the places where children played and elders told stories by the hearth. It is a rhythmic, soothing motion, a cradle song for a continent. We are safe in the arms of history, held in the memory of the earth. The tides turn, the moon pulls at the deep, and the forest sleeps on, dreaming of the sun. As the silence deepens, the image of the waves becomes a soft grey haze. The world of the surface, with its noise and its hurry, recedes into nothingness. There is only the long, slow drift, the descent into the quiet places where time has no meaning. We are like the silt settling on the floor of the sea, finding our place in the stillness, becoming one with the ancient landscape. The North Sea is a cradle, and we are its children, lulled to rest by the weight of the ages. Sleep comes now like the rising tide, inevitable and gentle. It fills the hollows of the mind, washing away the cares of the day, leaving behind a smooth and empty shore. We sink down, deeper and deeper, into the cool, dark heart of the drowned forest. The trees are there, their branches reaching out like welcoming arms. The rivers are there, flowing silently toward a distant horizon, and as the last of the light vanishes, we are left in the perfect, velvet dark of the deep, where the only sound is the heartbeat of the world, steady and slow, steady and slow. The journey is complete. The land has returned to the sea, and we have returned to the source. There is nothing left to do but breathe and listen, and let the water carry us away into the dreamless dark. The forest is waiting, the sea is waiting, and as we drift, we know that we are home. Beneath the waves, the silence is absolute. It is a silence that has been cultivated for 8,000 years, a sacred stillness that guards the secrets of the people of the plain. We join them now in their long rest, sheltered from the wind, protected from the cold, wrapped in the eternal embrace of the North Sea. The rhythm of the water is our rhythm. The cycle of the earth is our cycle, and in the deep, quiet places of the world, we find the peace we have been seeking. Fade now, into the blue, into the grey, into the black. The forest is still, the sea is calm, the world is at rest.